Welcome to the inaugural episode of the Ronin's Notebook. My name is Mark Stewart, and my special guest is Matt Thornton, founder and president of Straight Blast Gym International. Thank you, Matt.
You're welcome.
Thank you for having me here at the gym.
Yeah, of course.
I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
So, all of you know who Matt Thornton is, most likely, if you're in the martial arts world. So he's very well known in the martial arts and combative sports world, and more recently involved in political commentary, political discourse, you could call it, if you'd like. And so we're going to touch upon some subjects here that deal with martial arts and fighting first and foremost, but of course go on beyond it as well. So as we were discussing before, what is your definition of duality and non-duality and how it applies? Well, first of all, your definition of it, but specifically how it applies to choosing what to train to become effective and the direction that you take.
So when I use the term non-duality, and we start talking about duality and non-duality, I'm talking about non-duality in the sense of Spinoza, for someone who's familiar with the philosophy of it. And how it relates to training, I think it relates to everything in big picture perspective. I think it relates to training in terms of psychology and mindset and performance at the time. Here's the thing though, Mark, I don't usually talk about martial arts in the sense of duality and non-duality, because to me that's more of a spiritual and big picture part of the art, and so in a way I separate that out. So with martial arts I take a very scientific approach to it.
Yeah.
And I think what you're talking about plurality, and you're talking about, correct me if I'm wrong, but you're talking about Bruce Lee's kind of mindset. Is that what you're doing?
I think what I'm referring to is the misconception that it's plurality.
Okay.
Yeah.
That
JKD is about plurality.
Okay, so
Yeah.
let me talk about that directly, because I think it'll be easier.
And not just JKD, but most systems outside of combative sports and or battlefield.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I think you and I will be able to have this part of the conversation really well, because you come from the Jeet Kune Do background, so you'll know what I'm talking about. A lot of people that probably listen to you and I have also come from that background. So when I was a Jeet Kune Do student, teaching Jeet Kune Do here in Portland, or Jung Fan martial arts, however you put it, the Jeet Kune Do concepts lineage of the art, and I became disillusioned. About the same time I became disillusioned and a little bit cynical overall, I happened to run into Gracie Jiu-Jitsu through Hickson and Fabio, which is kind of fell in love with it.
Yeah.
But my concept of what Jeet Kune Do should be, and what I think SBGi is, if we're talking about best practices, is in contrast to what it normally is. In the Jeet Kune Do concepts world, I think you have a kind of an all-you-can-eat buffet approach to training. And there'll be some things, what I noticed was there were some things that were very practical, boxing, Muay Thai, some of the, Dan would call the Jung Fan martial arts, and the Bruce Lee more related striking. I liked a lot of that, and I think it was very practical. And then there was other things that I just found to be ridiculous. Some of the things that they were doing from Silat, some of the things they were doing from Kali. And so you had some things that were alive, and those always tend to come from combat sports, so all the sports related, and then a lot of dead patterns. So on one hand, in, for example, the Absorb What Is Useful book, Guru Dan's talking about side-by-side photos where they would have, Paul Benak in a boxing stance, and then a picture of him in a karate stance, and they're comparing between the two. And to me, I think that's an important thing to do, because martial arts is an empirical activity. There are good, better, best ways to do things. And how do we find those best ways? Well, you do have to compare methods. And so I really like that. I consider that kind of a utilitarian approach, which goes back to Bruce's saying, which he took from Mao Zedong, but absorb what is useful, reject what is useless. To me, that made perfect sense. That's what attracted me to Jeet Kune Do. But then what I also saw happening were they bringing in, importing these dead patterns, many of which kind of make karate look practical by comparison.
Right.
And there was really no discrimination between the two. And the thing that I think bothered me the most on a personal standpoint is I would hear the instructors who were teaching that stuff talk privately differently than they did when they were in front of a group. And so privately they would talk about how, well, if it's an actual fight, we're going to go Muay Thai or whatever. And in the group, it was just like, well, all arts have something good to offer and can be useful, some very, trite nonsense. And that started to bug me.
Yeah.
It reminds me of preachers who, if you go talk to, if you're debating some Christian preachers, and sometimes you bring up, for example, Noah's Ark and the fact that you may not think that story is really a news report, maybe more of an allegory for something. And they'll say, oh yeah, of course, it's symbolic and here's what it means, and they'll give you some Joseph Campbell type definition. But then when they're talking in front of their parishioners, they teach it as if it's an actual news report.
A scientific proven fact, yeah.
And so that
like the world's only 5,000 years
exactly.
old. Yeah.
And so that's what bothered me about the Jeet Kune Do concepts idea. And I also don't like the idea of, I'm going to train this style, I'm going to train that style, I'm going to train this style, and we're going to pick the things that work from the styles. I don't think that's the way to think about martial arts, which I'll get back to in a second.
Yeah.
The other end of that, the original, for lack of a better term, the original Jeet Kune Do people, the people who were trying to teach more of what they say Bruce Lee taught when he was alive, basically teaching a style. They were teaching Bruce Lee's style. And the idea that you're going to try and mimic what a 33-year-old, 130-pound guy who died in 1973, was it? 1973, the way he fought, to me I think is ridiculous.
Yeah.
And even if movie star, but even if we take that out, he's not a movie star, and instead we pick somebody who we know was actually an amazing fighter, Sugar Ray Leonard. I don't think the best way to learn boxing is to get a room full of people together and everybody tries to mimic how Sugar Ray Leonard fought.
Correct.
So now we have these two extremes. We have one extreme where they were kind of rigidly trying to teach the style of a one man, and to me style is something individual that everybody develops. It's not something you model. And on the other hand, you had a kind of lazy approach to martial arts where there was no discrimination, and a lot of the students I met in Jeet Kune Do, they had no idea the difference between trying to execute some kind of Silat movement and the difference in Muay Thai, for example.
Yeah.
So I rejected both those ideas, and instead the way I think about martial arts is, and that's why I like to use the word delivery system. You have stand-up, clinch, and ground, and weapons. We'll just talk about hand-to-hand.
Yeah.
Stand-up,
Yeah.
clinch, and ground.
Yeah.
There's only so many ways you're going to throw a punch, a knee, an elbow, or a kick. Here's clinch. There's only so many physical positions you can find yourself in with another body, underhook over, and so forth and so on, and on the ground. And let's focus on the physical skills and root movements that work the best in stand-up, clinch, and ground, which when we're talking about striking is some form of kickboxing. And when we're talking about the clinch, we're talking about arts like Muay Thai and folk style and freestyle wrestling, Greco-Roman wrestling, and if you have cloth on judo. They're all sports, by the way, because all sports have a live training method. And if we're talking on the ground, you have what we have now, which in America, which is a kind of a conglomeration of jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which has been Japanese jiu-jitsu that's been heavily modified by the Brazilians and now has the influence of wrestling put all together. And so my thought is, what are the core fundamentals for striking? What are the core fundamentals for clinch? And what are the core fundamentals of the ground? What are the things that everybody who by definition is really good at those particular ranges all have in common? What are the things that everybody that's going to fight at those particular ranges need to know? Let's focus on teaching those fundamentals to students, and then through a process of alive training, which a lot of people, when I say aliveness still, they think I mean sparring. I know sparring is alive, but drilling and working in a healthy way where people aren't going to get hurt. through a live training of those fundamentals, ultimately every student develops their own style. Just like, you're going to teach the fundamentals of striking, clinch, and ground to an MMA fighter, and through the process of them training for 5, 6, 7 years, having multiple fights, they eventually develop a style. And then you get, to name one of our fighters, you get somebody like Conor McGregor. That's Conor's style. And if John Kavanaugh took 10 other people who wanted to fight in the UFC and he tried to teach them Conor McGregor's style, that would be ridiculous.
But should he share some of it with him?
Well, what he should share are the fundamentals that everybody needs to know. And there may be some style-specific things that Conor does, that Conor's kind of figured out, like ways he can fake or move. But even those things evolved as a result of who Conor is, the way he moves, the length of his body, his mindset. So my approach to martial arts is to learn the fundamentals of the root skills of the delivery systems.
Yeah.
And the fundamentals of those delivery systems are always found in combat sports.
Right.
And the reason they're in combat sports is because in sport, everybody cares about the result. So because they care about the result, they use an epistemology that's practical. And then, through a process of live training, over a long period of time, a decade or more, each student develops their own style. So just to circle back to an art that we would all understand, and to give a solid example of that, in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, I try and limit myself in what I do to teaching just the fundamentals. And the really interesting thing to me about the art, and this is true of boxing, it's true of wrestling, there's a depth to those fundamentals. Like, every time I think I've learned everything there is to know about, like, say, a knee elbow escape, a movement that the jiu-jitsu you learn as a white belt is generally the best jiu-jitsu, and it's deep, and you can spend decades just learning the mechanics of those fundamentals. So that's what I impart to my students. But by the time my students get to purple belt or brown belt, each of them is totally different. They have different types of guards they like to play. They have different types of cross-side tops they like to play. They have different setups and movements that they use. Those are specific to them as individuals. And if I tried to have everybody do jiu-jitsu the way I do, in other words, I step out in front of the seminar and I teach what I use, I screw up that process, because I have 35 black belts at this point. I think we have, just in Portland, we have 700 and something students. I've been teaching 30 years. I've never produced a black belt that has my style. I'm 6'8", weigh whatever. I have my own, mentality and how I do things. Yeah. And so one of the things I tell my coaches that are teaching is, anytime you go back to first person pronoun and you start using the term I like this, I do that, you need to be careful, because that's really in a way irrelevant. What matters is, what are the core fundamentals? Like, you need to know this in order to get good at this delivery system. This is important. It's not optional. And if everybody,
it's not in your opinion.
It's not in your opinion. And if everybody died tomorrow, this is the thing that's destined to be reinvented by the next generation.
Don't you think that it's possible that these founders of these styles, as we call them, which in turn were probably used by either gangsters, police, or military originally, and then became combative sports later, it seems to me that it's logical that they did exactly what you're doing, but when they stopped fighting and they had the luxury to create a larger picture and keep the students around to support them for a longer period of time, that they took that luxury and expanded it into something that went outside of the idea of firm, solid basics that will save your ass.
Sure. Pitch, I do think that's possible. I do think that's happened in some cases. I also think that it hasn't happened in a lot of cases, and the reason why I say that is there's so much mythology attached to traditional martial arts, for lack of a better term. Yeah. And it's very much like religion. They'll all have a story about a founder who was frail or blind or whatever, and then developed this weird style, a nun in a monastery, and she had to feel her way through. And they were deadly, and like Morio Yeshiva, for example, was supposed to be so deadly and take all these challenge matches, and then they use that now as an appeal to authority. guru or founder or whoever did it this way. He said this, he did that, or she did that.
It was an ass kicker, yeah.
And so, because that's the nature of how martial arts work, like religion, does that mean by definition that the story they're telling has some truth in it? Maybe, maybe not. Because if you are involved in something where there's no opponent process, where there's no science behind it, there's no testing, there's no aliveness, you can make up whatever you want, right? I've seen a lot of martial arts that I think were just made up by somebody who wanted to sell and make money, and I'm skeptical that they ever had anything to do with fighting. Sistema. I don't think anybody that's invented Sistema knows anything about fighting. I think they came up with a clever way to do something, and they just pass it along, but I think probably even whoever invented it in the first place, it was nonsense when they invented it. And it's going to be nonsense 10 years from now because the epistemology is wrong.
Yeah.
And all you have to do, this is the nice thing about martial arts, and something Sam Harris has said before, that martial arts make delusion physical, but they're also easy to prove, right?
Yeah.
When we're talking about certain subjects, the nature of the universe, or duality versus non-duality, and those kind of things in a philosophical sense, they're not always falsifiable.
Right.
A lot of times we're talking about people's subjective opinions and how they view the universe in a particular way. When we're talking about martial arts, you can test it. You can take two people, you can have them put on enough gear where they're not going to get hurt, and not hurt too bad, and in a physical sense, let's go until somebody taps or submits, and do it over and over again, which is what the Gracies did, what the Brazilians did. And when you do that over and over again, what evolves is something, I think at this point now, in 2023, we know what's going to happen. If you take a Wing Chun guy and you take an Aikido guy and you put them in a cage and you make them fight over and over, well, first of all, when you first make them fight, what it's going to look like is two guys trying to do MMA who don't know how to fight. Two guys who don't know how to punch, two guys who don't know how to clinch, and two guys who roll around on the ground holding each other.
Like the original UFC.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And over time, if they're smart and they evolve, over time, you will eventually get to something that kind of looks like modern MMA.
Yeah.
And anybody has access, anybody watching this now, everybody in the world has access to that epistemology. Anybody can do it and try it. And one of the reasons why people don't do that, aside from not wanting to test themselves that way, which is different, is this mythology that it's so dangerous. You remember before the first UFC came out, you'd hear people talk about how could you could kick the front with a side kick, everybody's knee's going to get broken. You can elbow them here. Like the original rules were no eye gouging. Yeah. Right? They didn't, and no fish.
Well, you could hit the groin. Remember?
You could hit the groin. Yeah. You could do it all. And there's people talking about how dangerous it was going to be, and because they didn't understand how hard it is to actually knock another human down or hurt a human when they're fully resisting. They didn't have the experience.
Yeah, they're not being ambushed.
Yeah. And so that's the beautiful thing about martial arts, that I think one of the reasons why I like it and separates it is because anybody who's listening to me now can test everything I'm talking about. And I'm quite confident at this point, having done this for three decades, is they're going to come ultimately to the same conclusion.
Let me run something by you that I was thinking about when you were talking. Because of the theme of the show, right? So from my perspective, because when I was a teenager, I was really turned on by the idea of, and I researched it quite a bit in regard to understanding yin yang and the Taoist thing, the Tao Te Ching and the Zen thing and all that stuff. So, when I read Bruce Lee's regurgitated philosophy from others, as he was speaking it, I researched the sources as opposed to listening to exactly what he said.
Yeah.
And so let me run something by you. This is like my approach into choosing training methods, and I want to get your take on it. So boxing, we'll take boxing.
Okay.
You have Angelo Dundee and Cus D'Amato. Completely different. They train a Tyson-esque fighter, they train a Muhammad Ali and a Sugar Ray Leonard type of fighter.
Right.
Now, from my perspective, I research both of those training methods and I experiment with both of them so I can get elements of them. To me, that's my personal way of doing things. So I'm not into, and I'll backtrack a little bit, I don't think Bruce Lee wanted to study every martial art in the world. He wanted to research it, which is a lot different. He wanted to see it, read about it, maybe feel it a little bit, and trust himself in regard to using it and tweaking it. That's my opinion. But anyway, what do you feel about the idea, let's say in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, if you have two opposite end BJJ guys in regard to their style, or MMA guys for that matter, that it's a good idea to look at the differences and see what you can pull from the two variations.
Well, I would answer that with a question, which is, why are you looking at the differences? And
because they tend to counter each other.
okay,
Yeah.
that's good. I think the reason why, I don't know what Bruce Lee really wanted to do. You can guess from his writing.
Yeah.
I think you're right. That's always been kind of my interpretation of it as well. I don't think he would type of guy who's going to go
20 black belts or
right.
some shit.
He's not going to do 10 years of Wing Chun or anything.
Yeah.
But I think what we're actually, like, what are we, when we engage in that kind of activity, when we're researching and we're looking at Angelo Dundee's style, and we're looking at Customato's style, what is it that we're actually looking for? And my answer to that is, which goes back to kind of what I was saying, is what I'm looking for is the things they have in common. What are the things that, if Mike Tyson didn't have that, Mike Tyson wouldn't be able to do all the other style specific things Mike Tyson does, wouldn't be able to do.
Actually, that's what I'm talking about, just say it.
Exactly. So, and the things that Customata and Angelo Dundee would have in common that they taught to their athletes are what I call the fundamentals.
Yes.
Those are the fundamentals of the delivery system. And in my mind, that if I'm correct, and if you're correct about what Bruce Lee was talking about when he was a young man, that's what I think he was after. Yeah. He was after a search for the fundamentals. That's what Jeet Kune Do should have been. What Jeet Kune Do should have been is, let's look at all these different arts. Be open-minded. Look at everything. I look at all kinds of stuff. I have you here at our gym today because I want to see what you have, and I've liked the material you taught. So it's not I'm closed off to anything.
Yeah.
But what I'm looking for is I'm looking for those universal fundamentals that everybody needs to know. And then what I want to do is give those fundamentals to the students and let them develop their own style. And a concrete example of doing it the wrong way, remember Marvis Frazier?
Yeah.
And he was more of a Muhammad Ali type boxer. And he was a good one. He was kind of a stick and move guy. His dad took over his training, and his dad kind of had him fighting his dad's style, more of, a Joe Frazier, more of Mike Tyson-esque type. And Marvis lost how many fights in a row and quit because he's not his dad. He had his own way of training. So I think as a coach of combat athletes, it's really important that I try not to interfere with my athletes and my fighters' process too much. If I see them doing a mistake that's a mistake related to fundamentals, then I want to correct that. And I want to focus on the fundamentals and get them doing that. But their individual application of it is always so unique. There's always, every single individual is going to be totally different, and they're going to develop their own style, which is why I use those terms delivery system and style separate. Style is not, in my language, is not a type of martial art. Style is an individual's personal application of the fundamentals of stand-up clinching.
Right, got it.
So yeah.
Yeah.
And I just didn't see that.
Yeah, I don't see it. I don't see it. Yeah. And also, just to go back a little bit, the claim has been made that Bruce Lee was doing exactly what you're talking about, but I don't see any evidence of it in regard to, they said he urged people to do their own thing.
Right.
But they also said that he taught everyone differently according to their needs. And I don't see evidence of that because I see them teaching all the same, well, not all of them,
right,
but mostly I see them teaching pretty much close to the same thing in regard to what people refer to as Jun Fan martial arts.
Yeah, teaching his style.
Yeah. And so it's there's still a lot more questions than there are answers in regard to it, but I'm kind of tired of it actually, to be honest with you people. But it's interesting to talk about because, that's what we were inspired by, that resource.
Oh yeah.
He
was very inspirational for millions of people, you and me. That's one of the reasons I was attracted to martial arts to begin with, is watching a Bruce Lee movie.
Yeah.
And it's fantastic. But also people have to look at it from a practical standpoint. He died in 1973 as a young man who had only been exposed to a certain amount of things at that time, and he was primarily a movie star.
Yeah.
And so what he was working on, and oftentimes showing and things like that, was related to that kind of choreographed type of fighting. He wasn't a professional MMA fighter. People like to talk about how well he would do or not do. Honestly, unless Bruce went and got himself a blue or purple belt in jiu-jitsu, he would lose his first round in any MMA fight because he didn't have that ground aspect of it. He didn't have the wrestling.
Yeah.
And, as far as stand-up striking, how good was he? I don't know.
We don't know.
As far as we know, he just had that one amateur fight in Hong Kong, right? As a kid.
And did some scuffs as a teenager hanging out with gangsters and stuff. Yeah.
So that's not a slam to Bruce Lee, and I'm not insulting him or saying anything like that, but it's a bit silly to put him up on a pedestal as some kind of ideal of what combat sports look like.
I also think that maybe it's possible that some of his students misunderstood that sometimes he was teaching and rehearsing and playing around with theatrical martial arts when he taught, and sometimes he was doing a more combative approach.
Yeah.
And so they kind of lumped it together because he probably didn't say anything.
Probably. Yeah.
Possibly. I mean, I kind of get that vibe because some of the material doesn't match.
Right.
It doesn't fit. And so that's kind of my guess, is that possibly would have happened.
We talked about this a little bit this morning, but one of the things that struck me about, I had some big aha moments, you will say, as I left the Jeet Kune Do world and started to take up what eventually became what we call MMA. And one of them was how hard it is to keep somebody from taking you down. Mm-hmm. So if you take two people and you have them glove up and you say, okay, touch hands and we're going to fight until somebody taps or gets knocked out, and nobody's going to come in and break it up. Once you get the takedown or it hits the ground, it's going to keep going the way the Gracies did. Yeah. We know what that looks like now, and that is what an actual fight would look like, in sort of somebody coming in and breaking it up. And in that kind of environment, it's actually really hard to keep somebody from taking you down. And if you don't have any wrestling, I would say, and the other person has some wrestling, it's pretty much borderline impossible, because you have to, by definition, knock them out before they get in close enough to pick you up and take you to the ground. Right. And so the first thing you have to have is you have to spend a lot of time on your clinch, your wrestling, and sprawling, things like that. Sprawling on somebody while you're throwing strikes, which previous to MMA wasn't a skill set, because these things were all separated. It wasn't really a skill set that people did. It was the first MMA people, the pioneers of the sport, that kind of put that together, striking and sprawling.
Yeah, and it was the wrestlers that came in and started to give the BJJ guys some trouble, like Dan Severn and others.
Yeah.
Right? But then, of course, they would learn BJJ. The BJJ guys would learn some of the wrestling, and then thus you have the evolution.
Yeah, and then you have somebody like, I'll use Chuck Liddell as an example. He had good wrestling, good striking. He was able to sprawl really well, and he had a skill that a lot of guys don't have as well, which he could hit hard going backwards. Yeah. And because he could hit hard going backwards, he had a chance to deal with some of these good wrestlers and potentially knock them out. Yeah. But all of those things are things you discover the moment you take up what I talked about before, is where you have two people fight until somebody breaks it up. Mm. And my feeling from having talked to so many of the Jeet Kune Do people, concepts and original, is that they've never done that. Because if they'd done that, they wouldn't have such an emphasis on being able to enter, or this idea that you're going to put in one strike and that's going to knock the person out. And that, to my mind, that kind of, let's say, mindset or philosophy, I think that came from point karate at the time.
Yeah, I agree.
The Joe Louis point karate type sparring. Totally. Where you get a touch and you stop.
Yeah, it looks like it. I mean, it looks like it.
Yeah.
And not only that, because of, how can I say, the lack of combination attacks versus single attacks.
Right.
And, or the emphasis, let's say. They had them, but it seemed like they had to run the boxing to get more boxing to get them. Many people know who he is, but many people don't understand what he went on to develop. And it was the direction that Bruce Lee was heading in the latter stage of his life or his career as a martial artist or teacher or developer of his martial art. So a lot of the things that what you would consider Ted Wong Jeet Kune Do now, or what I call latter stage Jeet Kune Do, I'm more comfortable with that because he never called what he did Ted Wong Jeet Kune Do. It was making it better. He wasn't afraid to evolve it. He wouldn't use those terms, right? But I'll give you when I'm doing my thing today, I'll show you. But we can talk about it now. You remember learning that when you did the lead straight punch that you turned your front foot completely sideways horizontally? There's no physics or structure behind that whatsoever. Right. It's totally bullshit, right? And so Ted Wong actually was the one to develop the one to where you either just turn your waist and you use that, or you turn your rear foot a little bit and then let it turn back to restabilize. That's genius, and there's so many examples of things like that he did. And this is the last thing I'll say about him. The other thing that he did, his son was a wrestler in college, so they wrestled together.
Nice.
And his mission was to be able to counter takedowns,
right.
All right? And he spent a lot of time doing it. However, it's limited to his art that he teaches, which is basically a narrow stance, a modified fencer stance, but quite effective, nevertheless. I mean, you need a wider base, really, to do it in a way that a wrestler would sprawl, or an MMA guy, right? But anyway, the point is that he did, reach out to other things so that he could counter them. And he always said to me, he goes, if someone wants to take you down, they're going to take you down. He said, it's your job to buy time. And that was his conclusion. Buying time for him meant level change sprawl, shooting the wedge into the neck and following up with hits. And, it was kept kind of at that, right? Now, that empirical process of doing it, how much of that was done as a part of it, I'm uncertain of.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. But he was, he was someone, I don't want to turn this into that, but I feel obligated to. He was someone kind of that he was a really private man, and he did things in his backyard, and he felt forced to come out publicly and do this just to kind of save his friends' art. You know what I'm saying, like that?
He didn't
in
like
his mind, he didn't like what he said. He said, if JKD dies, it'd be sad, but it wouldn't bother me. But to see what's happening to it now, I have to do something.
I see.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So very interesting. So in regard to MMA, then. In regard to Straight Blast Gym International, right? Your boys trained Connor over there, right?
John Kavanaugh's one of my first black belts.
Yeah. Any other fighters in the MMA world that are involved with you guys? I mean, that are like that we would know.
If I start mentioning people now, I'll forget somebody. But out of the camp, you had Adam and Roy Singer, who were two of the original SBGi instructors. You had Forrest Griffin and Brian Bowles.
Right.
You have Chris Connolly out of Atlanta, who has a whole squad of fighters that are in there now. So there's we've always had a pretty strong influence in there from the very beginning, and now between John Kavanaugh in Ireland, Chris Connolly in Birmingham, Alabama. We've got big fight camps and teams that are coming up, and people that are working their way through the ranks. So, in the organization as a whole, the thing that binds us together is the general philosophy of pursuing the truth and teaching what works, and training in all the ranges. But you'll have some instructors who might have a smaller gym and are focused mostly on jiu-jitsu and teaching everyday people. You'll have other bigger gyms like my own, where they do MMA, striking, and jiu-jitsu and put it all together, and some of them will have a fight team. And then you'll have other gyms where they have that, but really the emphasis for the head coach there is the fight team. Like, for example, Chris Connolly, although he still teaches class, and John Kavanaugh, although they still teach class, I mean, I think that they would agree with me that their full-time focus is training professional fighters. That's what they do. So, it's a big organization. We have a lot of schools. There's never any pressure on anybody to do anything other than what they want to do and feel comfortable doing, as long as what they're doing is true.
Yeah.
And so, depends on where you go. It'll be more of an emphasis of MMA or other.
Are you personally still teaching striking here?
We do have striking, yeah. We've always had striking.
But you as well? I mean, are you coaching striking?
I haven't taught striking in a long time.
Okay.
So
who's doing that? And
my brother.
Oh, okay.
And one of my early black belts is Rick Davison. Hopefully he'll be here today. You'll be able to meet him. But I passed on the MMA comp team to him about 7 or 8 years ago. Just because a lot of it's my travel and being away, I didn't feel like I could be here for every practice for the fighters that need me. And it was just my own personal interest of what I was doing. And so I passed it on to Rick and Brian Walsh, who's a long-time old-school boxing coach that we've had here. And the two of them together under Rick have run the comp team, and he's done a great job. So we have a few guys that hold the belt locally. And we have usually somebody on the card every time there's a MMA bout. It's been a while because of COVID, but so yeah, we have that here at the gym.
And so then you also have mixed classes to where, I mean, obviously MMA, do you isolate and then integrate? Is that how you work it?
Different gyms will do it different ways. So there's some SBGi programs where usually what happens when you first come to our gym is you're going to go through what we call foundations class. And that's where we're just going to, this is for people who've done nothing before. We kind of teach them the fundamentals of what they need to know, how to train, kind of how to behave, just like kind of the culture of the gym. And kind of what we want to do is we want to build them up for the first 8 to 12 weeks, because most people that quit that first month.
Yeah.
When you have a commercial school, the vast majority of people that quit within the first couple of months. Sure. And so we want to, rather than just throw them in there and then have all this attrition, I want to build these people up. I want to make weak people strong. I don't want to just cater to people who are already strong. And so we have a foundations program. Once they graduate foundations, they can go where they want to go most. And some of the gyms will have MMA classes right away where everything is integrated.
Yep.
Here at my gym, we have them separated, and then you go to the MMA practices and comp team if you want to put it together. Right. And the reason why I have it separated is I've had a long time rule at my gym that anybody that fights for us has to get the approval of the comp team, head of comp team, so Rick. So if you're going to fight for us and have us corner you, we have to say it's okay. You can't just go out and get your own fight and say you're an SBGi fighter.
Yeah.
And one of the requirements for that is they have to be at least a blue belt in jiu-jitsu. So I felt that was important because I didn't want to see our guys, men and women, go out and fight and wind up getting submitted by some silly accident with the guillotine or something they didn't know how to counter. So by the time they get to blue belt level in jiu-jitsu, which usually, if they're training really hard all the time, takes a couple years, maybe 2. By that time, they've got some good fundamentals. Same thing with boxing. I want them to have good fundamentals of boxing, right? So they've got some good striking. They know how to do it mechanically correct. They understand how to handle themselves on the ground. And now we put them in the MMA comp team and they start integrating and putting it together. That's our approach. But like I said, there's some of the other gyms where once you graduate that foundations program, you immediately begin training it together as well.
Yeah.
But I want to see all our fighters and everybody continue learning and evolving in jiu-jitsu as well. My goal is hopefully for all of them to eventually become black belts.
Right.
So, we also have them put on the gi and come into jiu-jitsu class and roll and train, so you learn their art that way.
Do any, just not exclusively, but also compete in, let's say, amateur boxing or kickboxing or yada, yada, yada?
Yeah, we have quite a few gyms that do that. We've done that a little bit here, not very often. I think most of the people, most of my students who compete do jiu-jitsu tournaments or MMA. But we have had that, and there's some gyms that focus on that a lot. So, for example, one of our gyms in Toronto has a big Muay Thai program, and they do fights. Our gym in Berkeley has had smokers where they put people out. Over the years, we've had people fight. One of my early fighters, my first generation of MMA fighters, was named Greg Piper. He was maybe 130 pounds with clothes on. He passed away some time ago, but he became a professional boxer. He was at that point the best striker that I've ever taught, and I could see that he could actually have a solid career in boxing, which, as you know, is a rough thing to do.
My goodness.
He passed away, unfortunately, before he really got a chance to do that, but he was working his way through the ranks.
Nice.
So if we have someone come to us that expresses interest in training boxing, we'll get Brian and Rick, we'll work with them, and they'll build them up, and we'll be happy to have them do that. But these days, rather than just do boxing and kickboxing by itself, it seems like most of the athletes we have come to us really want to do MMA.
Right. Makes sense. And it seems that the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu offers that template to train smart. And
Yes.
then you can apply that to the stand-up stuff as well.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think people should apply it to the stand-up stuff, and that's one of the things that's the rarest, I think, in the MMA community is, everybody has jiu-jitsu instructors, everybody's works with wrestlers. Finding striking coaches who can get people good at striking without developing brain damage, which is so important, is pretty rare.
That's my goal.
That's an awesome
That's
goal,
my goal.
but I can tell you that that's what all the gyms really need,
Yeah.
and I think that's more of a new development, because when I used to box and I would go to the gym, you know what it's like, and you're either going to have a fight and work your way through the amateur ranks, or you're not going to fight. But it's not an art where they take average people and teach them how to box and build them up over time. It's like, okay, you're a fighter, you go here, you start fighting,
Yeah.
you either got it or you don't,
Yeah.
and pretty rough.
That's rough.
Rough way to do it. And so I've been really pleasantly happy. I'm happy to see that evolution take place in striking. John Kavanaugh has a saying that I like, which he says, we want to update the software without damaging the hardware.
Yeah.
And so, I think sometimes some people might be surprised if they watch some of John's practices and with Chris Conley and Adam and the people who have really good pro MMA teams, how soft some of the sparring is. Because we don't want these guys to be going into a fight with a concussion.
Yep.
We don't want them getting beat up before their fight. So, and that circles back to a point that I've really tried to make over the last 20 years. When I first came out, what I was always talking about was aliveness, because that's what people needed to know. There's still a lot of misconceptions about that. But one of the biggest ones was when I started to talk about aliveness, a lot of people took that to mean, oh, you got to spar hard and basically just throw two people in a cage with gloves on and have them bang it out. And that's obviously not what we do.
Yeah.
And over the years, I'll be the first to admit, when I first started teaching, the training was way more rough than it should be, especially with the striking. But as we've learned as science has learned about concussions and what happens, we've kind of evolved. And so, like the second 10 years or so that I was doing seminars, aliveness was part of the message, but a big part of the message was how you train alive without people getting hurt. And the big point I like to make is that anybody can train alive. This idea that it's too rough or you're too old is a myth. If somebody that says that means they don't know how to do it. They don't know how to do it, but that doesn't mean there's a way to do it.
Correct.
And even at the professional level, when we talk about the best fighters in the world, like Conor, the majority of what he's doing in terms of his sparring and alive training is all alive. But the majority of it is at a pace and in a way where he's not going to get a concussion, he's not going to get hurt, he's not going to get broken. And so anybody that's listening to this, anybody that hears this, you can do that. It's very easy to do with jiu-jitsu. That's one of the reasons why I love jiu-jitsu is you can train 100% realistic, roll with somebody. I can pull some big guy off the street and let him do whatever he wants, roll with it, and then be able to control their body in a very gentle way.
Yeah.
With striking, it's a lot harder, right? If you have to dominate somebody, a lot of times you have to put some power into it.
Yeah.
So it's easy to achieve that goal with grappling. To be able to achieve that with clinch is a little harder, wrestling is a little bit harder, but can be done. And then to achieve it with striking is, I think, the goal. And there's not that many coaches that can do that. And part of that I just think is because most of the really good striking coaches came from the boxing world, right?
Yeah.
And they're used to training with full-time fighters that are. But yeah, that's an important evolution one that I'm really happy to see.
Yeah, skill development, right?
100%.
And if you're constantly battling, well, yeah, not in the sense of aliveness, but banging. If you're constantly banging, it's not really skill development. You're always doing what you do best, and that's it.
Right.
What's your definition of duality and non-duality in regard to training martial arts and becoming an effective fighter?
Good, yeah. You mentioned that because I think you mentioned that you had seen a video where I was talking, I think, to Rokus, and we were talking about that. And people can look that up. I think it's on our YouTube page. But Rokus and I were talking about that pretty much in the concept of, for lack of a better term, I don't want to lose anybody here, but spiritual practices. So he had come from a particular background and a philosophical, spiritual background, and been disillusioned by it. So had I, and so we were talking about it that way. Non-duality means not two, and from a philosophical perspective, we're talking about Spinoza, and the idea is pretty simple: is that pretty much anybody who has a big, mystical experience, for lack of a better term, they tend to come to the same conclusions about the nature of the universe. Whether we're talking about Christian mystics, Meister Eckhart, and people like that, Islamic mystics and Sufis, Buddhists, Hindu, on and on, they come to some kind of understanding about non-duality.
Correct.
What Aldous Huxley called the perennial philosophy. And so many of us have had those experiences. And then how do you interpret that experience, and what does that experience do to you? In my particular case, it sent me off on a chase through that world. And so I spent the better part of 10 years or so meeting with different spiritual gurus and people like that, and kind of investigating that world. And the negative side to that is I think it also tends to send people down a path where they start searching for that experience over and over again. And the irony behind it is that it's very egocentric. So then it winds up becoming about you, about your experience. And in my case, it's basically just made me more of what I was, which at the time was pretty much a hedonist. You know what I mean? Just searching more after those experiences and that feeling. And ultimately what I realized is, from my perspective, that's not what it's about. What it's about is, for me, when I use the term spiritual these days and I talk about it, is my relationship with other people, my relationship to my wife, my relationship to my children, my relationship to my students and friends, in that order. How well I am, how useful I am, how helpful I am, how connected and honest and engaged and loving I am with those people, and trying to be closer to my wife all the time and closer to my kids, is my spiritual practice. And so for me, I kind of went through that, became a bit disillusioned about it, realized that it wasn't manifesting itself in a good way in terms of who I was as a human, and I began to focus more just on those kind of relationships with the people who were close to me, and trying to use that to become a better human. Where that fits into martial arts is, I think, in a very real way, an art like jiu-jitsu or any martial art can be used for the same purpose. There's a lot of, like, jiu-jitsu is a physical relationship with other people, right? You're engaged in a physical relationship with them. And you can help, jiu-jitsu can be used as a tool to help you deal with your ego. You learn so many valuable things, even as you age and you get older. You have to deal with certain physical realities that occur on the mat as you start to get older, and that ideally doesn't mean it will, it's not sufficient in and of itself, but it can help you down that path of being more open and loving with people.
Right.
So how martial arts and that philosophy fit together, for me, that's it. And I find that when I'm teaching, I do seminars or whatever, I don't need to discuss that. I don't bring it up. I'm happy to talk with you about it.
Yeah.
Honestly, I think the last time I've ever had a conversation about this topic was that conversation with Rokus, which is on video.
Yeah.
It's just not something, I discuss, and part of that is because it's just totally unnecessary. Like, the process itself is enough. If somebody walks through my door and they want to use jiu-jitsu as a vehicle for self-improvement, it's there, right there. And all I have to do is create a facility where they can come in and not get hurt, and they can go through it, a place where they're safe. And what are they safe doing? They're safe making themselves vulnerable. That's what you have to do in jiu-jitsu. You have to leave yourself vulnerable to other people. So we have a safe place for people to come be vulnerable, physically, emotionally, everything else. And that can then, if they want to, be a vehicle for self-improvement. So where the non-duality and the mystical part of it and martial arts fit together, that's it.
Yeah.
The only other thing I would say on there is, over the years, I came to the conclusion as well that you can't really be a good. I consider myself a skeptic, which goes back to my show you were talking about with Peter Boghossian.
Yeah.
Like that. I was a skeptic as it comes to martial arts.
Yep.
But I'm that way about everything. If I feel like it's an objective question that's going to admit to empirical study and answers, then I think that that's a field for science.
Sure.
But I came to the conclusion over a long period of time that you can't really be a true mystic without that skepticism. Because without that healthy grounding in skepticism, without being able to understand where you're actually dealing with a scientific question, you can't form your thoughts. You can't create rational progressions. Very, very hard time even being able to keep yourself in an ordered way. And what happens is their life becomes chaotic, and it kind of, whether people believe it or not, it kind of goes back to kind of a hedonist type thing. And the flip side of that is I don't think you can be a really good skeptic or use skepticism in the way that it can be used in a higher sense without having that aspect of yourself, the mystical aspect of yourself, where you leave yourself open to those kind of personal experiences. So I have personal friends that I love who are hardcore scientific skeptics. And they're great people. I love them. There's certain times, there's certain topics, there's certain areas where I feel that are closed off to them because they can't access it, just because they can't allow that part of themselves to, they can't be open to that.
Right.
And the only way to come open to that is sometimes through a positive experience with drugs, hallucinogenics, or LSD or DMT or mushrooms, but otherwise that kind of closed off to them. And do I think that, for a lot of them, those kind of experiences would be valuable? Sure. At the end of the day, to me, what matters is how they treat other people and whether or not they're happy. But, if I was going to pick a way for them to be, I would put them a little bit over here. And on the flip side of that is I have friends and people that I love who are so far over in that mystical side that it's very difficult. A lot of times I see they live in a kind of a sort of chaos. It's very difficult for them to use reason. And at the extreme edge, they even kind of demonize reason and thinking in and of itself as if there's something negative about it. And I think that that's really deleterious for them as well. So there's a balance between real scientific skepticism and always being open to that, and going where the evidence takes you, and an openness, and I use the word mystical, but I just mean a openness to what the universe has to show you.
Yeah.
And you kind of try and balance that. Where martial arts fits into that is martial arts can be a vehicle for those. A lot of people have those kind of mystical experiences through martial arts. They'll have that moment where they feel they're in the zone and they're no longer paying attention to the sub-vocalization in their brain, and they're in that flow state. And but just to circle back, so I'm not talking too much, at the end of the day, I think what matters is it make you a better human? Does that make you have better relationships with the people who are closest to you and the people that you engage with in the world? And if it's not, it's not the right path.
Do you feel that when you discovered that was basically it, that you just kind of let go to it, but you kind of knew that all along and you're just kind of fighting against it? Or not?
Discovered what part of it?
Just that's what it was about.
The initial like mystical experiences?
No, the letting go of the facade of the hedonism, and where basically the most important thing is how to love people.
So here's what I see happen all the time. People will, if you're searching after those states of consciousness, or even those answers, let's just talk about big picture answers, if you're searching after those, and it becomes a very selfish pursuit. And even if it's selfish in the sense of in your mind you're thinking, oh, I'm going to make myself a better human being, I'm going to be more enlightened, I'm going to be this. It's still you, about me, right? And it leaves a kind of an emptiness and a kind of a hole in your life that ends up getting then a need that they think needs to get filled with something else. I think this is where people start to import things like religion and other things like that. And it's just they're searching for a way to fill up that hole. And then I think other times what happens is if we live long enough and experience it, we start to realize that when you're truly the happiest, it's not when you're searching after your own needs in a hedonistic way. It's actually when you're in service to other people.
Right.
Yeah. And so, if your goal is just to be happy, if your goal was just happiness, right? I think the long term people would figure out the more you're thinking about other people and trying to be of service to other people and be connected to other people, and the less you're thinking about yourself, the happier you're going to be. For a lot of people, myself, that takes a long time to learn that, and but I think when you do learn that, it can save you a lot of time, and then you can organize your life in a way where you are happy. But I think a lot of people struggle with that. You can see somebody who's, let's say we have a super wealthy, super famous. We'll talk about a professional athlete or a fighter because we're talking about martial arts. Yeah. Somebody that's worth millions and millions of dollars, who's superstar, and you want to sign autographs of it, and you pretty much can live your life doing whatever you want, having whatever woman you want, eating wherever you want, going wherever you want, and you indulge that. I don't think that person's going to be happy. And then that's where the drugs come in, and all the other stuff gets put in there, and that hole is still there. And you can have somebody else that works at a car wash. Nobody knows who they are. They're not making a lot of money, but they spend the majority of their time, developing kindness and close relationships with other people, not thinking about themselves, thinking about other people. And the person that works at the car wash can end up being a lot happier than that fighter. And what does it take to teach people that? I think sometimes, for me anyway, it has to just come from personal experience.
Yeah, and simply by teaching by example and not preaching, basically. Yeah. And that's your message in martial arts.
Yeah.
If you're not the example that your students, if you're not the example of living what you're teaching and it being you, then they're always chasing that demon side of things. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Yeah. Interesting.
There's what I would see happen in that spiritual world is you'd have these people that I think in many cases really did have a true mystical experience. And so for a moment of time they have, for lack of a better term, what we'll call a realization of non-duality. And in those moments are extraordinarily powerful and probably more pleasurable than anything else they've ever experienced. And then they start to search after that, and they identify with that as a sense of as who they are as a human being. Yeah. And then they wind up getting put on a kind of pedestal, basically putting themselves on a pedestal. And the whole thing becomes a negative as far as them being happy and everything else. Yep. And we can see the same thing happen in martial arts. Sure. They'll initially get to a certain point. You'll achieve a certain status, and then, for example, I'll use jiu-jitsu. You get to being a higher level black belt, and you identify with that as who you are. And you have all these students who look to you, and you identify with that as who you are. And you take yourself out of the process. You no longer go on the mat, especially as you get older. Because why? Because, well, your younger black belts are going to submit you. And I see this happen all the time. And so they eventually stop rolling, and they stop being on the mat, and then they wind up identifying with that sensei guru role too much. And it's the same thing, you become happy, right? Whereas if when you're teaching, while you're teaching is all you're really focused on is helping the people around you at that time as best you can, and you keep yourself in the process. Then, you know, there's so many days where I've come home from jiu-jitsu having taught a good class because I was focused on helping, and by definition when I'm teaching a good class, all I'm thinking about is my students at that moment. We can help them. They don't have a role, maybe lose, you know, or win, I don't know, tough role, but I get that, myself gets in, I become part of that process. And I go home and I'm sore and I'm tired, but never been happier.
Yeah.
Like to me, that's a good day on the mat.
Yeah.
And if I reverse that, if I stayed off the mat that day, because there's somebody there and I don't want to have to tap or whatever, or while I'm teaching, it becomes this ego thing about me and trying to show off what I know, what I can do, then even though it may feel like, you know, people might think that that's going to, well, I want to be that person, so that's going to make you happy. You drive home after a class like that, the whole thing's going to become negative.
Yeah.
Right? And then they wind up quitting jiu-jitsu.
Yeah. Yeah, and you analyze yourself on the ride home and think, what an asshole I was that day, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's that vicious cycle of negative.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah, I just kind of feel, because I think in the past 5 years, I've been, maybe 10 years, been going through something similar. But it feels to me like I'm just letting go to it and that it's been there all the time. That's why I brought that up. It's not like that. It's not like that I didn't know that I was screwing up before. I did. You know, I just didn't let go to being positive earlier on. You know what I mean? Yeah.
No, I do think that what changes when you switch things over and do discover that, you know, your happiness, the more you're serving other people, the happier you can be. At the end of the day, what changes isn't the world. The universe around you doesn't change. You can look back and say that was always there. Those people were always there. The possibility and circumstances for me to do that was always there.
Yeah.
But you know, the only thing that changed is you, and that's where you get the better experience. And if we're just talking just pure philosophical, big picture level, that's also pretty much what those mystical experiences are about. When you have those mystical experiences, you see the world a particular way, but the world didn't change. Like all of a sudden, when the Buddha achieved enlightenment, the world around him didn't change. The world was what the world was always. He was just seeing the world from a different perspective at that moment, right?
Clarity.
Yeah.
You know, I was big in I still enjoy listening to Alan Ross because he's so charming. But he was recounting his session with a Zen master and talking about seated meditation, Zazen. And the Zen master laughed and he goes, meditating to achieve enlightenment is like washing blood with blood. He said, if you can't do it in your everyday life, you'll never be able to do it.
Right.
And that always stuck with me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very true.
Yeah. So Matt, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Mark.
It's been educational for me, and you know the reason I do these things, by the way, is selfish. It's for my own education primarily, and then for the rest of the people that may find benefit from it.
Thank you for being here.
Thank
Happy
you,
to have you here.
Thank you.